There are moments in history when a company stands on the edge of two eras, one ending, one just beginning, unsure whether the skills that carried it through the past will be enough to build the future. For Lockheed, that moment arrived in the summer of 1945. The war was over, the guns were silent, and the factories that had once thundered day and night with the rhythm of the arsenal of democracy suddenly stood eerily quiet. Tens of thousands of workers packed their lockers for the last time. Assembly lines shut down. The colossal camouflage net, once disguising an entire fake suburb, was rolled up and hauled away. The war had made Lockheed a giant. Peace now threatened to shrink it. But just when it seemed the company's future might narrow, an entirely new frontier opened, one that would test Lockheed's imagination, its engineering, and its ability to reinvent itself. This is the story of how Lockheed stepped into the jet age, the oceanic age, the global age. How it built some of the largest aircraft the world had ever seen. How it dove into the unknown with daring designs, bold leadership, and a young workforce hungry for challenges. And how, in the decade after World War II, Lockheed transformed from a wartime manufacturer into a worldwide powerhouse shaping commercial aviation and military strategy across continents. The end of war and the search for purpose. When victory was declared in 1945, Lockheed faced a brutal truth. War production had sustained the company. Peace would not. Military contracts evaporated almost overnight. The government canceled thousands of aircraft still on order. The massive Vega plant, once bursting with workers, echoed with emptiness. Robert Gross, Lockheed's charismatic president, understood the stakes. Either the company would reinvent itself quickly, or it would fade like so many wartime giants before it. He addressed the workforce with a mix of hope and urgency. The war had proven what Lockheed could do. Now, he said, it was time to prove what Lockheed would do. The answer came in the form of ambition. Ambition on a scale few American companies had ever attempted. The Lockheed Constitution. The giant that came too soon. In the late 1940s, the U.S. Navy approached Lockheed with an audacious proposal: build the largest, most capable aircraft in American history, one that could transport troops, heavy equipment, and even naval cargo across oceans faster than ships could carry them. Lockheed accepted. The result was the Lockheed R-6V Constitution, a double-deck, long-range four-engine giant whose sheer size stunned the aviation community. The aircraft stretched nearly 160 feet long with a wingspan of 189 feet, larger than anything Lockheed had ever attempted. So large, in fact, that the engineers had to design new fabrication tools just to handle the parts. Inside the Burbank plant, workers stared in awe as assembly jigs rose higher than the factory rafters. The Constitution dwarfed even the B-17s once built on the same floor. Its enormous radial engines, Pratt & Whitney R-4360s, were among the most powerful piston engines in the world. Yet despite its engineering brilliance, the Constitution was a tragedy of timing. It arrived at the very moment the jet age was blooming. Piston-powered giants, no matter how advanced, were already becoming obsolete. Only 2 Constitutions were built. They performed well, but the world had moved on. Still, the program left a lasting legacy. It expanded Lockheed's understanding of large-scale fabrication, advanced metalworking, and long-range aerodynamics, knowledge that would pay off in ways few foresaw at the time. The pilotless ocean and the Neptune rises. As the world adjusted to peace, a new threat emerged: the Cold War. The Soviet Union expanded its influence across Europe and Asia, and American military planners realized something alarming. The oceans, Those vast blue deserts once considered natural barriers were now potential battlegrounds. Submarines, surveillance, long-range reconnaissance, anti-submarine warfare. The U.S. Navy needed eyes and ears over the sea, and they needed them quickly. Lockheed responded with the P-2V Neptune, an aircraft that would become one of the longest-serving patrol bombers in American history. Designed for oceanic surveillance, submarine tracking, and long-distance reconnaissance, the Neptune was rugged, reliable, and flown by crews who understood just how lonely the open ocean could be. In 1946, the aircraft proved its capability in spectacular fashion. A specially modified Neptune, nicknamed the Truculent Turtle, took off from Perth, Australia, carrying so much fuel that its takeoff run nearly consumed the entire length of the runway. It climbed sluggishly at first, but once airborne, something remarkable happened. It kept flying, and flying, and flying. 11,236 miles later, after more than 55 hours in the air, it landed in Columbus, Ohio, breaking the world record for the longest unrefueled flight. The message to the world was unmistakable. Lockheed could build aircraft that reached across oceans and continents without stopping. The return of commercial dreams. And the L-188 Electra. With the military side stabilizing, Lockheed once again turned its attention to commercial aviation. The company had tasted success with the pre-war Electra, but the post-war market demanded something new. An airliner faster than piston transports, yet more economical than the early jets. Lockheed's answer was the L-188 Electra, a sleek, efficient turboprop designed to bridge the gap between the old and the new. Powered by advanced Allison 501 engines, the Electra promised greater speed and smoother flight than any piston airliner on the market. It was elegant, quiet, and engineered with Lockheed precision. In the 1950s, airlines wanted aircraft that could cross continents, serve regional routes, and operate reliably from shorter runways. The Electra delivered. When it first appeared, passengers marveled at its speed and comfort. Airlines praised its fuel efficiency. Pilots admired its handling and resilience. And although early structural issues forced modifications, the Electra evolved into one of the most successful maritime patrol aircraft in history, the P-3 Orion. The Orion's four-engine design, long endurance, and versatile airframe made it an essential Cold War sentinel. It patrolled oceans, tracked submarines, gathered intelligence, and served dozens of nations. Even today, decades later, the P-3 remains in service around the world, an enduring symbol of Lockheed's engineering legacy. Building a new industrial empire. During these years, Lockheed expanded beyond the Burbank plant. New assembly buildings rose across Southern California. Test facilities advanced. Wind tunnels multiplied. New materials such as high-strength aluminum alloys, titanium, and advanced composites crept into the company's vocabulary. The workforce changed too. Veterans from the war years stayed on, bringing discipline and skill. A new generation of engineers, many of them young men returning from military service, arrived eager to shape the jet age. Drafting rooms filled with fresh graduates from Caltech, Michigan, UCLA, MIT. The mix of experience and youth fostered innovation. The company grew more global, more diverse in mission, more confident in its abilities. The shadow of challenges. But growth did not come without problems. The post-war years were unpredictable. Budgets rose and fell with political winds. Contracts were awarded, canceled, resurrected. The Constitution program faltered. The first generation of Electras faced unexpected aerodynamic challenges. Competition from Boeing and Douglas intensified. Lockheed was strong, but it was not invincible. And beneath the surface of the company's achievements, something else was happening. Something quiet, almost invisible. A small group of engineers, led by a young, sharp-eyed, relentless man named Kelly Johnson, were beginning to operate differently, faster, smarter, more independently. They worked in a rented circus tent. They broke rules, bent workflows, and ignored bureaucracies. They delivered aircraft at impossible speeds. They called themselves Skunk Works. And in the next chapter, they would change the world. There are stories in aviation that sound like legends, too daring, too improbable, too extraordinary to be true. But the rise of Lockheed's Skunk Works is not legend, it is history. And it begins not with a board meeting, not with a government directive, but with something far simpler, a tent. A hot, smelly makeshift circus tent beside a foul-smelling plastics factory. And inside it, a group of engineers who would rewrite the boundaries of flight. The birth of Skunk Works, an origin like no other. By the late 1940s, Kelly Johnson had already earned a reputation as one of the most brilliant engineers at Lockheed. He had designed the P-38 Lightning, helped convert the Super Electra, and solved crisis after crisis. But Johnson was restless. He hated bureaucracy. He hated paperwork. And more than anything, he hated wasted time. In 1943, Lockheed received an urgent request from the U.S. Army Air Forces: design America's first operational jet fighter in absolute secrecy. German jets had already flown. America needed its own, and fast. Johnson told management he could deliver the new aircraft in 180 days. They gave him the project, but not the space. Every building at Burbank was already filled with wartime production. So Johnson improvised. He gathered a hand-picked team of engineers, just a few dozen, and set up shop under a rented circus tent beside a chemical plant producing a foul odor. Someone joked the smell resembled the odor from a popular comic strip called Lil Abner, where a moonshine still named the Skunk Works produced a toxic brew. The name stuck, first as a joke, then as a badge of honor. Within 143 days, 37 days ahead of schedule, Johnson's team delivered the XP-80 Shooting Star. It was the beginning of an engineering philosophy that would guide Skunk Works for decades. Small teams, absolute secrecy, rapid prototyping, minimal bureaucracy, maximum accountability. Johnson eventually codified these principles into his now famous 14 rules, still studied worldwide by engineers and project managers. But the jet fighter was only the beginning. The world was changing. The Cold War had begun. And soon the United States would need eyes that could see where no aircraft had ever flown. The challenge. No one could solve by the early 1950s. American intelligence agencies faced a crisis. The Soviet Union had sealed its borders, moved military installations deep inland, and built an air defense network capable of shooting down any high-altitude bomber. Satellite reconnaissance did not yet exist. President Eisenhower desperately needed a way to see behind the Iron Curtain. When the CIA approached American aircraft manufacturers, most declined. The mission seemed impossible. The aircraft would have to fly higher than any fighter, faster than artillery shells, and lighter than competing designs. It would need the wingspan of a glider, the weight of a sports car, and the reliability of a long-range bomber. Kelly Johnson didn't hesitate. He told the CIA he could build an aircraft that would fly above 70,000 feet, beyond the reach of Soviet missiles. It would be fragile, unconventional, and radical. But it would work. The CIA approved the project in 1954. Johnson's team called the new aircraft Article 341. The world would know it as the U-2. The U-2, a plane that flew higher than the world's fears. The U-2 was unlike anything ever built. Its wings stretched nearly 80 feet, long, thin, delicate, almost bird-like. Its fuselage was narrow, its structure so lightweight that a mechanic leaning too heavily on a panel could dent it. But it was designed for one purpose: altitude. Built in absolute secrecy, the U-2 was assembled at the remote Groom Lake facility, later famous under another name, Area 51. Test pilots flew dawn missions over the Nevada desert, pushing the aircraft to heights once considered unreachable. And when the U-2 finally entered service, it fulfilled Eisenhower's greatest strategic need. It flew over the Soviet Union at altitudes exceeding 70,000 feet, photographing missile sites, military installations, bomber bases, and nuclear research facilities. It helped identify the truth behind Soviet bomber capabilities, corrected intelligence overestimations, and gave American leadership clarity during the tensest years of the Cold War. But the plane was not invincible. May 1, 1960, the day the sky fell. On a routine surveillance mission over central Russia, U-2 pilot Francis Gary Powers was struck by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. The aircraft shattered. Powers survived, was captured, and stood trial in Moscow. The incident triggered a global crisis, embarrassing the United States and forcing Eisenhower to confront a reality Johnson had long anticipated. The Soviets could now reach the U-2's altitude. If the United States wanted to continue gathering intelligence, it would need something far more advanced, faster, higher, and harder to hit. Kelly Johnson already knew what that aircraft would be. The A-12, the secret beginning of the Blackbird. In 1958, Skunk Works began designing an aircraft that seemed to defy physics, an aircraft that would cruise above 90,000 feet at speeds exceeding Mach 3. It required materials that did not yet exist, engines that had never been built, and a shape so revolutionary that radar waves would slip past it like water. To survive the heat of Mach 3 flight, the aircraft needed skin made of titanium, a metal that was rare, expensive, and extremely difficult to machine. Ironically, most of the world's titanium came from the Soviet Union. Through a web of shell companies and foreign intermediaries, the United States quietly purchased Soviet titanium to build an aircraft meant to spy on the Soviets. The project was labeled Oxcart. The aircraft was designated A-12. Its creation was a symphony of engineering challenges, fuel that wouldn't explode at 600-degree ARV engines that wouldn't melt at Mach 3 seals that expanded in heat and shrank on cooldown, a fuselage that leaked fuel on the ground but sealed in flight a shape engineered not for lift, but for invisibility. Test flights began at Groom Lake under extreme secrecy. Pilots, including legends like Bill Park, Ken Collins, and Bob Gilliland, pushed the A-12 higher and faster than any operational aircraft in history. But the public would never know the A-12's name. They would know its successor. The SR-71, the fastest airplane ever built. In 1964, Lockheed revealed the aircraft that would become a Cold War icon, the SR-71 Blackbird. It was the most beautiful, most terrifying, most astonishing aircraft ever to touch the sky. Jet black, needle sharp, shaped like an arrowhead. Its engines, Pratt & Whitney J-58 turbo ramjets, could accelerate the aircraft past Mach 3.2. At top speed, the Blackbird outran missiles. No SR-71 was ever shot down. Its performance remains unmatched to this day. The Blackbird set records that still stand. New York to London in 1 hour, 54 minutes. Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. in 64 minutes. Across the continental U.S. in 1 hour, 7 minutes. At Mach 3, the aircraft stretched several inches from heat alone. Pilots wore full pressure suits similar to astronaut gear. Landings required extreme finesse, as the aircraft touched down at speeds over 170 knots. The Blackbird became the ultimate symbol of Skunk Works philosophy: fast, secret, revolutionary. But behind every legendary aircraft was a team: engineers, fabricators, welders, and technicians who worked in secrecy for years without recognition. Many could not even tell their families what they were working on. The Blackbird was their triumph. Kelly Johnson, the man behind the myth. Through it all, Kelly Johnson led with a mix of genius and ferocity. He demanded excellence. He tolerated no excuses. He believed in relentless iteration, personal responsibility, and small teams empowered to make decisions. His rules were simple: be quick, be quiet, be on time. Johnson retired in 1975 as one of the most decorated engineers in American history, 2 Collier trophies, medals from presidents, and the respect of every pilot who flew his creations. But his true legacy was not just the U-2 or the Blackbird. His legacy was the Skunk Works itself, a way of thinking, building, and daring that continues to shape aerospace innovation to this day. The world would never be the same by the time the Blackbird took to the skies. Lockheed had transformed from a wartime manufacturer into a creator of the most advanced aircraft on the planet. The company that once built wooden airplanes in an old China factory was now producing machines that touched the edge of space. This was not just engineering, it was revolution. Silent, secret, astonishing revolution. And yet, for all their triumphs, another era awaited, a final chapter for the Burbank plant, filled with both achievement and heartbreak. The jet age was soaring, the stealth age was emerging, and Lockheed's greatest transition was still to come. When historians look back on the rise and fall of America's great industrial landmarks, they often focus on the victories, the inventions, the breakthroughs, the triumphs that reshaped the world. But they sometimes overlook something just as meaningful: the last moment when a place, once full of life, begins to fall silent. For Lockheed's legendary Burbank plant, the birthplace of the Vega, the P-38, the Hudson, the U-2, and the SR-71, that moment came slowly, quietly, almost invisibly, not with explosions or failures, but with a gradual shifting of priorities, technologies, generations, and economics. It came with the final rollouts of aircraft that marked the end of one epoch and the beginning of another. To understand the final chapter of Lockheed Burbank is to understand how an industrial empire met its twilight, with dignity, with innovation, with heartbreak, and with a legacy so vast that even its closure could not erase it. This is the story of the L-1011 Tristar, the move to Palmdale, the birth of stealth, and the closing of a factory that once changed aviation forever. The post-Blackbird years, a company at a crossroads. By the late 1960s, Lockheed was standing between two worlds. On one side, its engineers had created the most advanced reconnaissance aircraft ever built. On the other, commercial aviation was entering a golden age, with wide-body jets reshaping global travel. Success in the civilian market promised stability and profit, something the secret world of Skunk Works could not reliably provide. Lockheed executives saw an opportunity. If they could design the world's most advanced wide-body airliner, they could secure their place in the booming jet age. Thus began one of the boldest, most ambitious, and most challenging programs in the company's history. The L-1011 Tristar, ahead of its time. The Lockheed L-1011 Tristar was an aircraft decades ahead of its competitors. It featured the world's first auto-land system, certified for zero-visibility landings, an advanced automatic descent control system, a state-of-the-art Rolls-Royce RB211 turbofan, unprecedented cabin quietness, a highly redundant hydraulic and electrical architecture, a safety record that would eventually become one of the best in history. Lockheed poured its soul into the Tristar. Engineers who once built the P-38 and U-2 now devoted themselves to perfecting pressurization systems, avionics racks, turbine inlets, and passenger comforts. The airline industry praised the aircraft's technology. Pilots admired its handling, passengers loved its smoothness, and airlines recognized its reliability. But excellence does not guarantee survival. The L-1011 faced delays caused by the financial collapse of Rolls-Royce during development of the RB211 engine. Boeing 747 had already dominated the high-capacity market, while McDonnell Douglas's DC-10 captured much of the medium-range segment. The Tristar, though arguably the best engineered aircraft of its class, struggled against forces beyond Lockheed's control. Yet for the workers at Burbank, the Tristar represented something more personal. It was proof that the factory could still innovate, still amaze, still lead the world in aviation engineering. Even as the project faced headwinds, pride remained unwavering. The shift to Palmdale. A factory outgrows its birthplace. The Tristar's massive fuselage sections and wing components were too large for the aging Burbank infrastructure. The plant had been built for wooden aircraft in the 1920s, expanded hastily during wartime, and retrofitted constantly for new programs. Streets hemmed in the assembly buildings. The railroad cut through production lines. Houses stood across the street from hangar doors. The future required more space. So, Lockheed made a decision that would reshape its identity. Heavy production would move to the high desert, to the new facility in Palmdale, at Air Force Plant 42. Burbank would retain engineering, prototype, and advanced development functions. But the era of major assembly, the era that had defined the town during World War II, was drawing to a close. When the first Tristar rolled out of Palmdale, workers from Burbank drove north to witness the event. Many felt a strange mix of emotions: pride in the achievement, sadness that it no longer belonged to their home plant, and uncertainty about what the future held. But as history soon proved, Burbank still had one final miracle to deliver. The stealth revolution, the F-117 Nighthawk. In the mid-1970s, the Pentagon issued a challenge unlike any in aviation history: design an aircraft nearly invisible to radar, not low observable, not hard to detect, but invisible. Many believed it was impossible. Others believed the physics required were not yet understood. Kelly Johnson, nearing retirement, assigned the problem to a new generation of Skunk Works engineers led by Ben Rich, a brilliant, relentless thinker who had cut his teeth on the Blackbird's propulsion challenges. Rich took a radical approach. Drawing on the work of Soviet scientist Pyotr Ufimtsev, Rich's team developed a way to mathematically predict radar reflections from flat panels. From these equations came the unthinkable idea: a stealth aircraft might not be smooth and aerodynamic. It might be faceted, angular, alien-looking, composed of thousands of flat plates arranged in a shape optimized for radar absorption. It would be unstable, requiring a fly-by-wire system to manage the aerodynamics. It would fly like nothing before it. It would look like nothing on Earth. And it would be built in Burbank. In the old factory buildings once used to assemble wooden Vegas and early Electras, engineers and machinists began fabricating the world's first operational stealth aircraft, the F-117 Nighthawk. The aircraft's existence was a secret even to most Lockheed employees. Workers arrived late at night, left before dawn, entered through locked doors, and said nothing to anyone, not even their families. The first test flight occurred in 1981 under deep secrecy at Groom Lake. Over time, the aircraft reached its full potential. The F-117 became the spearhead of American air power in conflicts from Panama to the Persian Gulf. When the aircraft was officially revealed to the public in 1988, the world was stunned. That such a machine had been designed, built, and tested in secret for nearly a decade was a triumph of engineering discipline and national security. It was also the last aircraft ever built in Burbank. The final rollout, F-117A Shaba, and the closing of an era. On December 20th, 1988, workers gathered for a ceremony unlike any before. Rolling slowly out of the Burbank plant came an angular, black, sinister-looking aircraft, F-117A number 59 Dow 255C, nicknamed Shaba. It would be the final aircraft completed at the Burbank facility. Men and women who had spent their entire lives building airplanes stood silently as the Nighthawk emerged into the sunlight. Many had worked on Hudsons during the war, on P-38s in their youth, and now stood at the birth of stealth technology in their later years. The contrast was staggering, from Sitka spruce to faceted radar-absorbing composites, from varnish and glue to plasma-coated edges. It was the symbolic end of a 60-year legacy. Lockheed moved the remainder of its operations to Palmdale. The Burbank site, once producing nearly 20,000 aircraft during World War II, slowly emptied. The buildings were sold, demolished, or repurposed. The old China factory, the brick structures where Amelia Earhart had walked, the wooden arches where the Vega was born, all gone. Only memories, photographs, and the stories of those who lived it remained. Harvey Kristen returns, a ghost of history. Years later, long after retirement, Harvey Kristen, one of the last living links to Lockheed's earliest days, returned to the abandoned Burbank plant. The gates were open. The guardhouse was empty. No one seemed to care. He walked through the quiet spaces where he had once seen rows of Vegas being assembled by master cabinet makers. He stepped into the empty hangars where the U-2 prototypes had been assembled in secrecy. He visited the places where he had once hauled parts as a boy, where he had witnessed the rebirth of Lockheed under Robert Gross in 1932. Now it was all silent. He stopped near one of the last standing walls, placed his hand on the cold concrete, and whispered, "This used to be a great factory, a great factory." It was a farewell not only to a building, but to an era of American craftsmanship and ambition that would never return. The death of a titan, and the legacy that outlived it. Lockheed Burbank did not fail. It evolved, it transformed, and ultimately, it completed its mission. It produced wooden pioneers of the 1920s, record-breaking aircraft of the 1930s, war-winning machines of the 1940s, Cold War sentinels of the 1950s, early jets and patrol aircraft of the 1960s, advanced transports of the 1970s, stealth aircraft of the 1980s. No factory in the world matched that breadth of achievement. The closure of Burbank was not the end of Lockheed. It was the passing of a torch. Palmdale, Fort Worth, Marietta, and other sites carried the company forward into new eras. Stealth fighters, space systems, reconnaissance satellites, and digital warfare. But Burbank was where it all began. And even though the buildings are gone, the impact remains. In the aircraft that still fly, in the pilots who trusted their lives to Lockheed designs, and in the engineers who grew up inspired by stories of Johnson, Gross, Rich, and the thousands of unnamed craftsmen who made miracles out of wood, aluminum, titanium, and secrecy. Burbank was not just a factory, it was a birthplace, a crucible, a legend, and even in its silence, it still speaks.